In this lesson, we'll take a look at how Spring Boot supports the cache-busting features within Spring MVC. When building a web application, it is common to cache our client-side resources in order to reduce page load times and improve the customer's experience on our application. Unfortunately, when we cache client-side resources, we expose ourselves to displaying or providing stale resource files to the browser. And this can cause some issues when a user is looking at our web page because they may not have the latest file versions. Luckily for us, Spring Boot and Spring MVC provide us with an easy mechanism to control how we version those client-side resources, and this essentially busts the cache. So to get started, let's take a look at our project. We have configured our project to use time-leaf templating. So you'll see that we've established a controller method that is mapped to the /timeleaf path, and that's going to navigate to our timeleaf template. The timeleaf template is configured to use a global.css file, and that file is going to color the message that we display to the end user. We can quickly launch this application just so you can see what we're working with. So I'm going to go to Run As, and then Spring Boot Application, and then we can navigate to our browser, and when we hit the URL, we see that we get our message in blue. Now let's return back to STS, and we're going to enable some of the resource versioning strategies within Spring MVC using the assistance of Spring Boot. So imagine that within the global.css file, we switch the color of our message over to red. Now, if that client-side resource, global.css, is cached on somebody's browser, how do we break that caching in order to display the new resource and have our message displayed in red? Well, we can use a property within the application.properties file to trigger some of the cache busting built into Spring MVC. So within our application.properties file, we're going to use the Spring Resources chain, and then we're going to pick the strategy.content.enabled property, and we're going to set this property to true. And then we'll also set the content pass. So the first property just enables our resource versioning strategy, and this strategy is going to basically rewrite the file names using a content hash. So each file name will now have a hash suffix to it, and because that hash will constantly change as we update our files, it's going to bust the cache. But what we need to specify in this pass property is the path that we're going to apply this versioning strategy to. And in our case, we're just going to look at pretty much everything. So every client-side resource, we're going to add this strategy to. Behind the scenes, what happens is a version resource resolver is added as a bean, and it works its way into the chain, and it basically sets the cache on these files way out to a year, and then we rely upon the change in the URL or the change in the file name to essentially bust the cache. So let's go ahead and we'll relaunch our application. And now we're going to navigate back to the browser, and we can load. There it is. We loaded our application, and let's reload it with some networking tracking enabled. And there you see the name of global.css has been modified to include the hash, and that's going to bust the cache. So let's return to STS, and now we're going to run through a demonstration of another strategy that we can use to version our resources. It may not always be possible to rename our files due to different technologies that we use within our view layer for our applications. To support other situations, Spring has provided a fixed strategy, and basically a fixed strategy puts a version on the path to the client-side resource, and in that way we bust the cache. So in order to enable a fixed version strategy, we simply go down to the .fixed.enabled property and we set that to true. And then we can go and set the fixed paths property and we'll leave that the same way as our last strategy. And then we have one additional property we must provide, and that's the version property. And this is actually how your path is going to be modified. So you will see that placed as almost like a subdirectory on the path. So let's go ahead, we'll restart our application, and we'll take a look at the fixed strategy and how it allows us to version our resources. So returning to the browser, we navigate to our client-side resource, and there, if we look at our CSS file, you can actually see that v5 was added to the path, and that is how we control the caching of global.css. There you can see the URL within our header. So it's a different strategy you can use when you can't change the file name of a client-side resource. So in this lesson, we took a look at how Spring Boot supports Spring MVC's cache busting features and how we can use that feature to make sure our users always receive the most up-to-date client-side resources. Now, this is a real simplification from how you would manually configure these features within Spring MVC. In Spring MVC, you need to manually declare a lot of these beans, and Spring Boot does a great job of simplifying it.